Senator Gillibrand!
Senator Gillibrand!
You are
complicit
in the...
What happens when Zoran Mamdani tells U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement that they're not welcome in New York City, and ICE answers anyway? Because that's exactly what just unfolded. Mamdani just drew a very hard line against ICE, framed it as a moral stand, and then turned it into a public showdown.
My heart goes out to you.
But then something happened that no press release could spin. A staffer inside City Hall employed by the New York City Council was detained. Now, the name matters. Rafael Andres Rubio Borges. Now, the authority matters too. U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Now, this isn't abstract politics. This is the moment that slogans collide with enforcement. Under Donald J. Trump, in January 2026, when federal law is being applied exactly as written, and for a lot of Americans that are watching right now, this absolutely hits a nerve. The feeling that rules only matter until they're inconvenient to the people in charge. So here's a question that frames everything that you're about to hear. Was this supposed to be a symbolic fight until it became personal? Because when ICE moved, the narrative flipped fast. What started as defiance turned into damage control. And once the facts surfaced, City Hall wasn't shocked by ICE, it was shocked by the consequences of his own rhetoric. Now stick with me, guys, because the part most people missed is where this story stops being about ICE and actually starts being about accountability. Be sure to drop a like for the video and subscribe. Okay, when Zoran Mamdani went public and declared that U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement was not welcome in New York City, this isn't some hands-off comment or some activist slogan. This was a deliberate challenge to federal authority from the New York City mayor, spoken loudly on purpose and aimed directly at enforcement under Donald J. Trump, who's actively restoring immigration law as written.
Mamdani is calling for the immediate release of a city council employee detained by ICE on Monday. Mamdani writing he is, quote, outraged by the worker's arrest, calling it an assault on our democracy. The National News Desk, Jeff Harris, joins us. And Jeff, details surrounding the detainment are continuing to develop tonight, including who this man is and why ICE arrested him. Break down what we know.
So DHS says the man is a criminal illegal alien from Venezuela who entered the U.S. on a tourist visa back in 2017, which expired that same year. But city council officials say that's simply not true. He was legally allowed to live and work in the U.S. until October of this year. According to DHS, the man whose photo was just released earlier tonight was identified as Rafael Bojorquez and had no legal right to be in the United States, which is why ICE detained him during a routine appointment on Long Island on Monday. City leaders, including Mayor Mamdani, reacting to his arrest on social media. Take a look. Writing, "It's an assault on our democracy and our values." City Council Speaker Julie Menin also speaking out, saying at the time of his arrest, no reason was provided.
They provided no other basis for his detainment. Everything that we know, this man was here legally, and he was legally authorized to work in the United States.
Now, Menin went on to say he worked as a data analyst for the city council for about a year. Democratic New York Congressman Dan Goldman calling him a law-abiding immigrant with work authorization. Now, the man has been transferred to a detention center in Manhattan, but Menin says they have been unable to reach his family members.
Now, here's the part that most people miss. Mamdani wasn't speaking as a protester. He was speaking as someone inside of City Hall, using the weight of the office to signal defiance. He is the mayor of New York City, by the way. I mean, so this matters because when an elected official tells a federal agency that they're not welcome, it's not symbolic. This is confrontational, and that's where the risk begins. Once you frame enforcement as illegitimate, you don't control what happens next. You have escalated. You have effectively drawn a line. Now, in 2026, with immigration already a national pressure point, that line wasn't ignored. It was tested. ICE's response was simple and legally airtight. Federal law does not require permission from local politicians, period. U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement doesn't operate on vibes, rhetoric, or even press conferences. It operates on statutes, warrants, and jurisdiction that supersedes local local objection. Now, this matters even more in 2026 because the U.S. Department of Homeland Security had already flagged sanctuary defiance as a priority issue under President Donald J. Trump. There was no ambiguity here. There's no mixed signals, no confusion about enforcement posture. So when Mamdani said ICE wasn't welcome, ICE didn't respond with words. It responded by continuing to do its job, quietly, procedurally, and without theatrics. And that is the tension that most politicians underestimate. Federal enforcement doesn't need to win the argument. It just needs to enforce the law. And that is where this story takes a sharp turn. So here's where the entire narrative snaps. During a routine immigration appointment, not a raid, not a sweep, not retaliation, Rafael Andres Rubio Borquez, a staffer employed by the New York City Council, was detained by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now that detail matters. This wasn't ICE storming City Hall. This wasn't a political stunt. This was a standard enforcement at a scheduled appointment, quiet, procedural, and by the book. And that's why the timing hit so hard. Mamdani had just gone to war rhetorically with ICE, drawing attention, daring confrontation, when suddenly enforcement touched someone inside of his own orbit. Now, the abstract fight became personal overnight. Up until this moment, Mamdani's stance lived safely in slogans. After his arrest, well, it lived in the consequences, because when enforcement reaches your staff, the argument stops being theoretical, starts becoming operational, and City Hall was not prepared for that shift. So this is where a lot of people in power get blindsided, because consequences don't usually show up with flashing lights. They show up quietly during routine appointments, in paperwork that you assumed was fine, in systems that you trusted because no one ever warned you to look closer. And this is not just true in politics, it's true in real life too, especially in retirement. Overpaying for healthcare. This is the hidden retirement tax that nobody talks about. A bad Medicare plan doesn't announce itself. It just quietly drains your fixed income every single month, and most people don't even realize it until the damage is already done. That's why I partner with Chapter. They help eliminate that hidden tax by reviewing and optimizing your Medicare coverage. And they do this so that you're not paying for gaps, overlaps, or plans that stopped serving you years ago. Now, most people, they're already dialing the phone number on your screen right now, 909-563-8279, or they're clicking the link down below in the description of this video, askchapter.org/Ron, to get clarity before small mistakes turn into permanent losses. Now, let's get back to the story, because once DHS released the paper trail, the fallout only accelerated. So once the detention became public, U.S. Department of Homeland Security released the details, and this right here, this is where the innocent staffer storyline collapsed. So DHS confirmed the individual overstayed a tourist visa dating back to 2017. Not last year, not recently, years ago. Then came the next layer, prior deportation orders and an alleged assault case tied to that same period. Now, this is the moment that the rhetoric stopped working, because facts don't bend to outrage, and no amount of press statements can erase a documented paper trail. Now, I want you to notice what didn't happen. DHS did not argue politics. ICE didn't trade insults. They simply laid out the record. Dates, status, enforcement authority. And that is the part that flipped the script. The story wasn't about aggressive ICE tactics anymore. It was about whether City Hall had been defending someone who never should have been on payroll in the first place. So the moment the detention hit the headlines, City Hall snapped into damage control mode. Julie Menon and Dan Goldman rushed out statements framing the arrest as unjust, unexplained, and politically motivated. Now, the message was clear. Defend first, verify later. That's the tell. When officials move faster than the facts, it's usually meaning that they're afraid of what those facts might show. So instead of asking whether the employee was legally authorized to work or whether vetting failed, the focus shifted immediately to moral outrage and institutional victimhood. And I want you to notice what's missing from these early defenses. There's no acknowledgement of DHS records, no discussion of visa status, no explanation of how a staffer with unresolved immigration issues somehow magically ended up on the city council payroll. This wasn't confidence, it was reflex, a political class closing ranks before the details could catch up. And once that happens, every new fact doesn't just clarify the story, it contradicts the defense already on record. So this is where Zoran Mamdani chose his framing. He called the detention an assault on our democracy. Very strong words, emotional words, words designed to move a crowd. Now, here's the reality check here. Federal immigration enforcement carried out during a routine appointment under existing law is not an assault on democracy. It's the execution of it. Democracy doesn't mean immunity. It doesn't mean selective selective enforcement, and it definitely does not mean elected officials get to nullify federal authority with press releases. Now, that phrase, assault on democracy, it wasn't meant to be legally precise. It was meant to inflame, to rally, to shift attention away from uncomfortable questions about vetting and accountability and consequences. And so this is the only time it needs to be said, because once the facts are on the table, the slogan collapses under its own weight. After that point, repeating it only makes the disconnect more obvious. So once the outrage cooled, a quieter and more dangerous question surfaced. How did this person get hired in the first place? Well, the New York City Council employs staff using public funds, and that means background checks, work authorization, and compliance aren't optional, they're foundational. So who verified the employment eligibility? Who signed off? Was documentation reviewed, or was ideology allowed to override procedure? Because this isn't a protest group or nonprofit. This is City Hall. And when enforcement touches someone inside your own operation, the spotlight doesn't stay on ice, it swings inward. So this is where the story shifts from politics to management. Sanctuary rhetoric is one thing. Administrative negligence is another. Now, if City Council failed to vet properly, that's not a federal problem. This is a local failure. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If this had been anyone else, any private employer, the consequences would have been swift. City Hall doesn't get a carve out from the rules it expects everyone else to follow.
As soon as you said that you were a Jamaican American, it immediately let me know your relationship to this country. And so because your relationship to this country is that you were an immigrant and your family wasn't imported through the slave trade, I understand that you're not a descendant.
It's not true. It's not true. Let's just stop there. Don't say anything about my family. I was born in the Bronx. You're about to say some nonsense right now.
You're a Jamaican immigrant.
But let's not even she's making a point.
He is a Jamaican American. I didn't state that. I'm not a Jamaican nothing. I am a free man. I'm a descendant of chattel slavery. Me, Whitley Janae Gates, my family. There is no Jamaica. There is no Caribbean for me to go back to. So his proclivity and how he sees this country is going to be completely different than someone who is a descendant of chattel slavery. Completely different. So of course he wants more immigrants here. Of course, immigration, specifically illegal immigration to him, as he stated, is a sign of growth. Of course, he believes that we should be utilizing our tax dollars and our resources to support people who've come over here, who've broken the law to be in this country, because it benefits his family. It benefits the story.
They don't get a pass. So then the internet did what it always does. Old clips resurfaced. Videos of Zoran Mamdani explaining how to challenge ICE encounters, how to refuse entry, how to stay silent, how to film agents, circulated again. And so by now, this is in a very different context. Before the arrest, those videos were framed as empowerment. After the arrest, they look like provocation, especially when enforcement didn't target a random resident, but someone on his own payroll. Now that contrast is devastating. I mean, you can't publicly instruct people on how to resist federal agents and then act shocked when enforcement continues anyway. You can't paint ICE as lawless while the record shows a routine appointment and documented violations. Now, the videos didn't help Mamdani's case at all. They hardened it. They turned his rhetoric into evidence of escalation. And once that happens, intent starts to matter just as much as the outcome.
Now, what you need to understand about this red green axis is that the threat is operational. Across our country, organized ideological movements are no longer operating on the margins of politics. They are entering elections, capturing institutions, and they're reshaping public policy from within. We've seen this again with the latest example of Zoran Mamdani, who is an immigrant from Africa, winning the mayoral race in New York City. And now we've seen the craziness that has come out of his inaugural committee. Look at this. This guy was just sworn into office. He takes his oath of office on a Quran inside a tunnel as an homage to Hamas, an homage to Hamas. And then on top of that, he's appointing a bunch of communists and Muslims who support Hamas, who support the Muslim Brotherhood, who say things like it's white supremacy to be a property owner.
This is the collision point. Sanctuary politics worked when they're theoretical, when enforcement is something happening out there somewhere. But the moment that U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement applies the rule of law to someone inside of City Hall, the message collapses. Not because the policy changed, but because reality showed up. Sanctuary rhetoric promises protection. Federal law promises enforcement. Those two can coexist only until they touch the same person. When they do that, well, the hierarchy becomes obvious. Federal authority doesn't pause for local talking talking points, and it doesn't negotiate outcomes to preserve the optics. What made this moment so jarring is that it wasn't dramatic. There were no raids, no chaos, just a routine appointment and a lawful detention. Now that calmness stripped away the usual outrage framing. There was no villainous scene to point at, only a paper trail and a process. And once that happens, sanctuary messaging isn't just challenged, it's exposed as conditional, powerful in speeches, powerless in practice. So here's the part that should not have surprised anyone. Donald J. Trump is in office. Immigration enforcement is no longer ambiguous. U.S. Department of Homeland Security has a renewed mandate, clear priorities, and political backing to apply the law consistently. Now, this wasn't a policy whiplash moment. This was the expected outcome of an administration that campaigned successfully on restoring enforcement. Sanctuary Defiance didn't catch DHS off guard. It was already on the radar. So this is why this incident reads less like retaliation and more like inevitability. When you publicly challenge enforcement under a president who made enforcement central to his platform, you're not forcing a showdown, you're inviting one. And so this is the miscalculation here. Mamdani acted as if symbolism still set the terms, but in 2026, enforcement does. And ignoring that shift is exactly how political theater turns into operational consequences. So here's where the story fully inverts. What began as a familiar narrative, ICE as the aggressor, politicians as protectors, suddenly flipped direction. The focus wasn't on enforcement anymore. It was on Zoran Mamdani defending someone who, according to U.S. Department of Homeland Security, had overstayed a visa and faced prior enforcement orders. Now that's a dangerous pivot, because once the facts are public, the question isn't why did ICE act? It becomes why is an elected official shielding this? The sympathy gap widens fast. Voters who may be skeptical of ICE still expect basic compliance with hiring laws and public accountability. And that is the moment that Mamdani lost control of the frame. He wasn't exposing a system anymore. He was explaining it away. The argument shifted from values to vetting, from rhetoric to responsibility. Once that happens, outrage just stops working and credibility takes the hit. So this moment really sticks because it just cannot be undone. Mamdani didn't force a reckoning with ICE. He forced one with his own administration. By escalating publicly and daring enforcement to respond, he exposed the fragility of sanctuary posturing when it collides with federal law. The lasting damage isn't just political, it's structural. Questions about hiring practices, internal compliance, and ideological blind spots, they don't disappear after the news cycle moves on. Critics now have receipts. Supporters have explanations to make. And City Hall, they have a credibility problem that it didn't have before this arrest. Now, under Donald J. Trump, enforcement's not a message, it's a mechanism. And when you challenge a mechanism with slogans, the mechanism just doesn't argue back. It just operates. So that's the lesson here. Mamdani didn't expose ICE. He exposed the limits of symbolic resistance and the consequences of crossing a line that you just can't enforce yourself.